yourself to be more in the beginner gardener category. Okay. Number 2. A few of those same people. That's cool. So I just wanted to, there's a lot to talk about in talking about seeds and saving seed, but I just want to try and give sort of an overview of some of the things that are important to understand just about plants and how they produce seed and what you need to know, because it's a different way of thinking about things. I think most gardeners now have gotten used to just, well, even just buying plants, not even growing things straight from seed, and not really thinking about that whole life cycle of the plant. So that's what seed saving is. So I want to try and introduce you guys to some of those concepts so that people can go out there and start getting into it. So what are some reasons why we might want to save seed? What do you guys think? Yeah.
You don't want to buy the packaging in.
Right. To save money. That's a really big one. It's probably the first one I have on my list. What else? What are some other reasons? Yeah, sorry, I can't.
I discovered this green zebra heirloom just this summer, and it was so fantastic that I want to save the seeds. I got the bugs or whatever they're called here, and they gave a little plant vegetable giveaway, and it's one of my favorite tomatoes.
Yeah, so getting varieties and keeping varieties that you really like is the other main reason I would say for saving seed. And so that's not only for you. If you have one plant that you really like and you want to be able to grow it next year, you're not sure if the nursery is going to carry the same thing next year. Or maybe you got the fruit from someone, but you don't actually have the plant or whatever. So for you personally, it's a great thing to do. But also in a bigger sense, the reason why we have all these heirloom varieties, or some other called heirloom varieties, is because people have made a point of saving those seeds for whatever reason, because they have really good traits, they taste good, they're resistant to bugs. And so it's kind of part of our heritage as gardeners to continue to do that. And it's part of the reason why those varieties get preserved. So we're trying to do our part. That's one of the reasons why the Seed Library of Los Angeles got started, so that we, even though we're urban gardeners and maybe we don't have a lot of space, so we can contribute to that variety preservation. The thing about variety preservation, though, it has some tricks to it. If you just wanted to save seed and you don't care what you're growing, none of what I'm about to say is really that relevant. You can just grab seed from your plants and grow it out. So I'm going to teach some of the principles of if you're trying to preserve varieties. And I can help you with that. Okay, cool. Was it kind of flying around? Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to write some things down. I mostly do that because it helps me think about what I'm talking about, but hopefully it'll be useful for you guys too. So really quickly, when I say variety, what does variety mean? Anyone?
Like 18 different kinds of tomatoes.
Yeah, so variety, it doesn't have that clear of a definition necessarily, but it basically just means a type of a plant that has very recognizable traits. People also use the word cultivar, which is actually a made-up word that is a combination of cultivated, just stands for cultivated variety. FYI, if you ever see that on a seed packet. So it just means that it's you can get that seed if it's called certain variety, that it's going to have certain traits. So I think the most important things to know when you're going about trying to get started with seed saving is how your plants reproduce. And the two most important distinctions to make is to know if your plant is an inbreeder or an outbreeder. Sorry. I'm just going to write down some key terms on here. So inbreeders are plants, well no, I'll start with outbreeders. Outbreeders are plants that mainly reproduce by crossing with other plants. Pretty easy to understand, that's how most things reproduce. Inbreeders, however, are plants that mainly reproduce by self-pollinating. And it's important to know that all plants, or pretty much all plants, can do both of those things. They can cross with other plants, or they can self-pollinate, for the most part. But that they tend to do one over the other. And which one of those things they do is really important for seed saving. So I'm going to talk about inbreeders first. Inbreeders have what are called perfect flowers, which means that doesn't mean they're better than other flowers. It just means that they have both male and female parts. So how many of you guys took biology in high school? Hopefully all of you. So the classic flower picture, you know, where you have the petals, I'm going to draw a really ugly flower, and you have the anthers that have pollen, and then you have the stigma and the ovaries and all that stuff. I don't know what kind of flower that would be, but that's your classic flower that has both pollen and then it has the ovary, which will turn into fruit and set seed. So inbreeding plants basically just take that, they are able to pollinate within the same flower. And that's primarily what they're going to do. And what you'll see is that plants that prefer, let's say, let's describe our plants with mental capacity. Plants that prefer to reproduce this way, they'll tend to have closed flowers. So an example is tomatoes. You notice if you look at a tomato flower, you can't actually see the anthers that have the pollen on it because they have sort of a layer of petals over them. Similarly with bean flowers and pea flowers, they're not entirely closed, but they have petals kind of covering their parts. Whereas if you think of something like a sunflower that's really big and open. So a lot of plants that are inbreeders will have those closed flowers. Not entirely. Lettuce is a good exception. They're primarily inbreeders, but they have the same open flower structure. But so one thing that's important to know about inbreeders, they tend to be a lot easier to save seed from because they're already kind of isolating themselves from crossing with other varieties.
I'm sorry, did you say easier to what?
They're easier to save seed.
Oh,
If you're thinking about variety preservation, because these plants they're always going to be more similar to their parents than, say, the seeds of an outcrossing plant, because they're just selfing, they're self-pollinating. So if you have a population of plants that are inbreeders, they're going to be very homogeneous genetically. And I won't get into it because I know it's not like a genetics class, but if anyone wants to know the ins and outs of this afterward, I'm happy to tell you. But they're just a lot more uniform. Whereas if you're talking about an outcrossing population, there's a lot more variety going on. So that's what I'll say about inbreeding plants for now. Outcrossers are a little bit more what we're used to when we're thinking about animals, you know, birds and bees, your standard reproductive model. So outcrossing plants generally need to have pollen from another flower go to another flower in order to produce seed. Now you might still have the same structure with the perfect flowers, but they'll still primarily prefer to cross with each other. So sometimes you'll have flowers that are self-incompatible, so there might be some kind of mechanism that causes the pollen to not be accepted within its own flower, or maybe or it might be more severe, such as squashes, cucumbers, and melons actually have separate female and male flowers. So they don't have perfect flowers, they have imperfect flowers, and obviously it's impossible for them to self-pollinate. Spinach is an even more extreme example. They actually have male and female plants. So you'll have one plant that only produces male flowers and one plant that only produces female flowers. So this makes things a little bit more complicated for us as seed savers because you have a much more diverse population. You have a lot more crossing and ins and out. And you also will see something that's called inbreeding depression. Which is basically the same principle as like why you shouldn't marry your cousin. It's the same thing with plants, that you have too much of the same gene pool crossing with itself over time. You get less vigorous plants. You get plants that get diseases, or they have stunted growth. They come up with lots of different problems. This doesn't happen with all outcrossing plants. For example, with the cucurbits that I mentioned, with squashes and cucumbers and melons, even though they have separate female and male flowers and they need to cross with each other, they for some reason don't seem to experience this. So you can have a relatively small population of squash and still get what you need to get out of it. But with some other, the classic example is corn. you really need to have a lot of corn if you're going to save seed properly over time. If you're just going to do it once for the, for posterity, that's fine. But over time, you're going to need a large population because if you keep inbreeding them, you're going to get lesser quality out there. Let's see here. So the another thing to keep in mind with outcrossing plants is because they need to cross, and so part of their mechanism is spreading their pollen around. When you're talking about varietal purity, so how true your variety is that you're growing, of maintaining its trueness, it makes it complicated because you're going to need to isolate varieties from other varieties so they don't cross with each other. And this is still true with those inbreeding plants that I mentioned. It's just a little bit less of an issue because if you're talking about something, say, like a tomato that has those closed flowers, it's just less likely for pollen from one to get onto the other. But if you're talking about those big open flowers, like in a sunflower or lettuce or squash, then they're actively trying to get insects in there to spread their pollen, so you have to control that situation. It's fairly easy to do, though. It just takes a little dedication. So it just requires that knowing the cycle of your plant. So for instance, you need to know how they're pollinated. So how are most of our vegetable crops pollinated? By bees or other insects, right? So you need to then prevent bees from going places where you don't want them to go. So you can do this either by caging the plants or putting netting over the plants. This does get complicated, though, when you're talking about outcrossing plants, because you do need to have that pollen crossing. So sometimes with some of those it's better to isolate with time. So you might just plant out one variety at the beginning of your season, wait till they grow and flower, or wait a few weeks depending on what plant it is. And then when you plant your next variety, that'll be staggered so that one's not going to cross with the other. And of course you can just isolate by distance if they're really far away. Usually in an urban context that's not very practical. For instance, if you have a garden plot here, which brings up an important issue, which is your neighbors and what your neighbors have. So that's why we're still a little bit unclear on the official SLOLA cross-pollination policy, right, David? And how much distance we think we need from plants. So it's all a big experiment, but it's something to be mindful of if you do want to get into seed saving, and choosing which plants you want to start with. So, and then some other important things to keep in mind are things other than insects, such as wind is another major pollinator that tends to pollinate things such as, what are some examples? Things that are wind pollinated. Corn is the big one. Generally, there's not too many vegetables. Other ones are beets and chard. Generally, things that have really small, insignificant flowers. Then they're probably not insect pollinated if you can't see their flowers. But I generally wouldn't encourage you to start with beets or chard if you want to be a seed saver because it's complicated. So what should you start with? So I already mentioned tomatoes as one of the easy ones because they have the closed flowers, they self-pollinate. Everyone always has lots of tomatoes around. Any other guesses as to things that might be good things to start with? Peppers, yeah, same thing. So they're really easy to harvest, really easy to scrape them out. They're also primarily self-pollinated. Eggplants are another one in the same family. So this is another important thing, is knowing which plant family your plants belong to is really helpful. I wanted to make a sheet of the different plant families and how they generally reproduce, but didn't have time. But there's a lot of resources out there so that you can find out if you're not familiar with botany and taxonomy already. It's really, really useful because things that are in the same plant family tend to reproduce the same way. So things that are in the tomato family tend to be self-pollinating, and it's pretty easy to work with them for seed saving.